nodding unanimity that stifles dissent, the tacit approval that someone else can determine what is permissible for you to say and think. We know this from our own history as a country, and our view on it is contained best in the dissenting opinion, the 1929 US Supreme Court case regarding the implacable Hungarian pacifist Rosika Schwimmer, who had refused to, been denied citizenship of the US for refusing to swear that she would take up arms to defend her adopted home. And in that 1929 opinion, which happens to be the year in which we were established, the aging Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who'd been a Union soldier, 3 times wounded in the Civil War, and therefore not given to mewling pacifism, is how Michael described it, declared that there was no principle that more imperatively calls for attachment than the principle of free thought, not just for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought of those we hate. We turn to the example just last night of the invasion of the launch of the book of Mr. Mayberg to see how far the tide has turned against us already. Go back 2 weeks before that and you get the hounding of the journalist Karima Brown, hardly a champion of many IRA positions, but she's been critical of the EFF and been hounded to an extent that included threats that she'd be raped for what she had said. And you think of that and you think of what happened last night, and you realize that Michael Morris was right when he concluded that it's not the ideas that threaten us, but the inverse, the shutting down of the conversations that we need to preserve openness and independent-mindedness. It's something we've tried to do throughout our history. We were established in the late 1920s, and the IRA would rise to become arguably the most influential anti-apartheid think tank in the world. And through that era, it forged the methodology we apply still today of using face-to-face lobbying, media pressure, and very rigorous analysis to get politicians, government leaders, and business leaders to abandon hopeless policies and adopt the policies that might one day see our country realize its great potential. Throughout that history, specifically, the focus is the advocacy for the right of you as an individual to make decisions about your own life, free from unnecessary government, political, or bureaucratic interference. Some of what we articulate is heretical. There are going to be 1 or 2 heretical ideas this evening. But they're not ideas that don't exist elsewhere. It's not that they are not thought, or that people don't dream them up, or that they're not quietly spoken about. It's often because people are afraid to express them. In a history of the Institute that was published in 1979, Ellen Hellman wrote that the essence of the Institute's work, to influence the minds of men, is by its very nature imponderable. But many believe that the effort has been meaningful and derive comfort from the fact that proposals that appeared at first heretical when expounded on Institute platforms have become commonplace today. And with that, I give you a little glimpse into where I'm going, but where we find ourselves in our country today. We have a very serious set of problems. Today, less than half of young people in the country have a job. If you want to put a hard number of it, for people under the age of 24, the unemployment rate is now almost 70%. It's an extraordinary thing. Since 2009, there have been more people on welfare than people with employment. Quality of maths and science education is ranked by various international studies. One of the more credible puts us at 128 out of 140 countries, with sort of Yemen or Afghanistan bringing up 140. What we spend on education in dollar terms, per capita terms, as a share of GDP, we should be somewhere in the 40 to 60 range, comfortably, of that global spectrum. The UK is at 41, give you a sense of who some of our peers should be. If current trends continue, of the grade 1 class that enrolled this year 5 in 100 of those children will pass maths and matric with a grade of 50% or higher, which is a very important marker, because given the changing structure of South Africa's GDP, those kids, if you give them to my analysts, they will say if they do their bit, the chance of them living a middle-class life one day is fairly good. Short of that qualification, the odds against that child are overwhelming. And we live with it, so we forget sometimes what its impact has been. But 500,000 of our fellow countrymen have been murdered since 1994, at a rate on a per capita basis that compares to war-related, so direct conflict deaths in the Middle East over the same period of time. And the collective trauma on the society is extraordinary. Our murder rate today at 30 per 100,000 people, or 33 South Africans murdered for every 100,000 in the country, is half what the rate was in 1994, when it was 67 per 100,000. But comparatively, the rate in Australia is 0.8. Gives you a sense of what we've learned to live with. And on current trends, there's not much that I could stand here and give you to say that we see that the turn is coming and that we are headed for something better. And that's not pessimism that's thrown at us sometimes. I always answer that question by saying that optimistic and pessimistic doesn't really apply in what my colleagues and I do. All that matters is that the analysis is on the mark and is right. And the view now that the turn is not imminently on the horizon ahead of us is borne out as a product of hard analysis of the economic data. Government debt levels have doubled over the past decade, and the budget deficit is back at the point that the ANC inherited at the end of apartheid. And the tragedy is this, that on coming to power, the ANC had cut levels of debt in half. The saving on the interest bill of the government had made possible the rollout of our social grants program. If the Treasury's own forecasts are realized on the 3-year timeline, the South African economy will be growing at 40% of the average rate of emerging markets around the world. And that's before you consider that Treasury 3-year forecasts have been off by about 50% over the past decade. And it's not because the Treasury doesn't know how to forecast, it's because they talk the thing up a little bit, but after 10 years, credibility is somewhat on the line. But this is an important one. That on average, so it's 20 years of average, and things change, so it doesn't necessarily have to go on that way. But on average, we've created 100,000 net new jobs in the country per point of GDP growth per year. So if the economy grew at 4%, we created 400,000 net new jobs. That's the rough rule, and it still even applies today. If we want to reduce the black unemployment rate to the white rate, which is a reasonable target because the white rate has remained lower than that of Western Europe and North America for the past 20 years, we need to double the number of black people with a job. That requires 10 million net new jobs in a decade, 1 million net new jobs a year, implying, which we're not suggesting we can do, an economic growth rate of 10%. And we're circling along at 1. If we get to 5%, which is perfectly within the potential of the country to do, and we see requisite deregulation of the labour market to price poor people into work, we can probably get to 5 to 6, maybe even 700,000 net new jobs a year. But at current rates of growth, we simply cannot do it. We cannot offer young people the chance at a better life. We were talking about them earlier. Today, 35% of South Africans are over the age of 35. We have a very young population that is going to find it very difficult to find their way into the formal economy in the decade that lies ahead. And what worries us isn't just the economics, because as the fiscal and the economic pressure builds, we get worried about the implications for civil rights. Government starts to display ever more dangerous behavior. It turns with ease to too easy to turn to racial nationalist rhetoric in the face of criticism. Does it with far too much comfort. Too comfortably it sides with the worst pariah regimes in the world, proposes media tribunals and hate speech laws, in order to foster social cohesion, more state encroachment in response to the poor performance of the economy, now going as far as ideas such as state-owned pharmaceutical companies, the absence of which is hardly the reason for levels of poverty and unemployment in the country. Poverty will be addressed via redistribution and historical injustice via expropriation. Racial divisions will be addressed by the stricter enforcement of racial quotas and edicts. Jobs will be created by higher minimum wages and stricter labour laws. And the moves now very swift to erode property rights set up the erosion of civil rights, given that the former anchors the latter in every fundamentally free and open society. And in the face of this, perhaps because people want to believe that it's going to come right, we too often see too great an effort to try and rationalize and normalize this behavior, almost to a point that you're asked to believe that what you can see with your own eyes isn't really happening. And the rationalization argument goes something like this, and we use the example of Mr. Ramaphosa, that he only attacks property rights in order to prevent anyone else from doing so. And therefore, in order to safeguard property rights, you must support those leading the attacks. Because only if they grow very much stronger and get a much greater political mandate will they stop doing that which they are now already so entrained in doing. And if you hear it enough and you hope that it comes right and you're not quite sure what he's all about, you can almost buy into it and believe it, but step back from it. Appreciate the implications. And it doesn't hold together. It comes out strongly that in famous speech that the Conservative MP Enoch Powell delivered in Birmingham in England in 1968. Infamous speech, smeared later as the Rivers of Blood speech. People forget that Powell, before I get to 68, had in 1959 made another speech on the Hola killings in Kenya, with British policemen beaten to death Kenyan dissidents in a prison camp who refused to work. And that 59 speech would later be described as the strongest statement on principle about Britain's relationship with Africa ever made in the House of Commons. So Powell has a track record. In 1968, he said the following, Birmingham to his constituents, that the supreme function of statesmanship is to provide against preventable evils. The trouble, he said, is that such evils are not demonstrable until they have occurred. At each stage in their onset, there is room for doubt and for dispute about whether they are real or imaginary. We see a lot of that in the country today. He goes on to say that people are disposed to mistake predicting trouble for causing trouble, or even for desiring trouble, and that they love to think that only if you perhaps wouldn't talk about it, maybe it won't happen. And he goes on to tell the following story. A week ago, I fell into a conversation with a constituent, a middle-aged, quite ordinary working man. After a sentence or two about the weather, he suddenly said, if I had the money to go, I would not stay in this country. I have 3 children, all of them been through grammar school, and 2 of them married now with families. I shan't be satisfied until I see them all settled overseas. Then this, in this country, in 15 to 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man, which is where the attacks on Powell, his later dismissal, came from. Reject the black man, white man analogy, because it's out of place, and replace it instead with the whip hand of the state. You dare not doubt that there are great numbers of South Africans, black and white, who feel the same about the state of affairs in our country today and are concerned about whether the country will offer a future for their children. And if you argue the point, we do a vast amount of polling and we can prove it. It's there across the board, even if people sometimes don't say it. And Powell went on to ask himself, how dare I say such a horrible thing? How dare I stir up trouble and inflame feelings by repeating such a conversation? His answer was that I do not have the right not to do so. Here is a decent, ordinary fellow Englishman who in broad daylight in my own town says to me, is Member of Parliament that the country won't be worth living in for his children, I do not have the right to shrug my shoulders and think of something else. What he is saying, thousands and hundreds of thousands are saying and thinking. I travel a great deal now since being told that we sounded like Deloitte, and do many of these events, and it's true. The widest spectrum of audiences you can possibly imagine, from the ultra-right in the far north of the country and the wild people up there, to the sort of student command of the EFF at the University of Johannesburg. We talk to them all sincerely. You see it, black, white. They see through the fake confidence of the organized business community that we believe, even as bond and equity outflows turn negative. It's always way CEO confidence against bond and equity flows. It tells you the story. They see through the defences of the ANC and see with disgust the corruption and ineptitude. Near universal disappointment with the lack of courage of the Democratic Alliance, and usually revulsion at the racism and violence of the EFF. And you get the sense, or I do at least talking to them, that there's the sense that they just wish that someone would say what they're actually all thinking and give them something to believe in. So we say as a group that we are in serious trouble as a country, partly because we don't have the right not to say so. And I wouldn't want to run into any of you one day somewhere. You say to me, I saw you that evening in Barrydale, and you knew because you had lots of analysts and this is what you guys do. And you knew, and you told us, don't worry, it will all come right. And we do that even more than just for your sakes. You'll all be fine, I'm sure. But more because for a significant portion of people in the country, if you live now in a shack on the rubbish dump in Hermanus, where I spent my Monday, my first sort of kicking off of this tour, life for you is already pretty terrible. Imagine your circumstances change to that extent. And that for moral reasons alone, therefore, we're compelled to directly confront what is actually going on here, so that we can do something about it. And when you do that and you talk frankly about what is happening here, you expose the first watershed in the analyst community. Like the chaps who speak directly and those who tend to qualify things a bit too much. But that leads to the second and the more important watershed and the bulk of what I'm talking about this evening. 5 years into our democracy, and those who feign ignorance think you need a technical team to inspect the boilers at Eskom to understand why the electricity went off. The problem lies somewhere else. And it lies for us, being an old organization that's been much involved in these things, it lies for us often in a proper understanding of the ideological currents that have shaped our country over the past 100 years. And for the purposes of this evening, to take you through some of those currents, we use the example of the African National Congress itself, because it's seldom done that way. Established in 1912, the organization that will later become the ANC, it's moderate conservative in its early years, remains that in the 20s and 30s. In the 1940s, it will even suspend some of its liberation demands in support of Smuts' efforts in the Second World War. It's an extraordinary thing to think when you think where we are today. But 48 comes along, and South Africa, or the white bit of it, hurtles towards apartheid, and the ANC is hounded into the waiting arms of the Soviets and the East Germans, who will infuse it with a lot of hard left ideology. An important date is 1962, when the Communist Party, that was the intellectual engine of much of the liberation struggle, under Soviet influence, adopts as its guiding ideology the idea of national democratic revolution. And its lobbying is very successful in the ANC, and in 1969, outside of Dar es Salaam at that party's Morogoro conference, the ANC will adopt, under SACP influence, the idea of national democratic revolution as its guiding zeitgeist, ideological zeitgeist. NDR doctrine, national democratic revolution, is based on Lenin's theory of imperialism. The wealth of colonial powers arises only out of the exploitation of the colonized, and that the purpose of colonial, anti-colonial revolutions must therefore be to dispossess the colonizer, failing which the colonized can never be free. The SACP will adapt the theory for South Africa's unique circumstances and for our immediate neighbours by introducing the concept of a colonialism of a special type, the term still in use today. And the special type is that in our circumstances, the colonizer is permanently integrated into the community and will never leave or go away. But despite that, they war. Purpose of the revolution must be to dispossess that colonizer, failing which the revolution can never be complete and the poor can never be liberated. And with lesser or greater enthusiasm, the ANC has recommitted to that MDR. The lesser and greater is the next part of this evening. Has committed to that idea, explicitly so, right up to this year. So we have 1912 and 1948 and 1962 and 1969. And the next date I take you to is in Switzerland, 22 years later. You're in Davos in 1991. Mr. Mandela has been released from prison, and he will appear before the Davos faithful to tell them what this man who will most likely lead South Africa, what the country is going to do. At great personal risk to himself, because the ANC hasn't yet held a policy conference, Mr. Mandela had rewritten the paragraph of the speech prepared for him dealing with the economy. And you don't get nationalize the commanding heights. You get a far more pragmatic message. And in that, as an aside, is the difference between him and Mr. Ramaphosa. Mr. Mandela announced ANC economic policy before the party had a policy conference. Mr. Ramaphosa is trying to determine policy as a basis of the decisions taken in the conference. It is the single most important distinction between the two, and why the one succeeded and the other may fail. He's enthused at the response. And there's the story of a later interaction with the Chinese who say to him, how interesting that you see this, that the world has changed since you went to prison. And look at us. We've changed as well. And they will continue to change all the way up to the wonderful point we're at now, where the Chinese in Washington, under the hammer and sickle, lecture the American administration on the importance of free trade in the world. It's a fantastic thing that has happened. And enthused by all of this, he'll emerge from Davos to tell his party that the world has changed. The Afro-socialist experiments have failed, and South Africa will pursue a more pragmatic path. And he lends his gravitas, and he's a ruthless individual, so he can do the turn, to the man who became our de facto prime minister in those early years, Thabo Mbeki, who will later draft the GEAR strategy, growth, employment and redistribution policy. We were critical of it at the time, but thinking back, it was a golden age and was a bite your arm off to get back there again. It was mostly pragmatic, certainly relative to what we've had over the past decade. And Mbeki had the other thing that politicians need too. They had ruthlessness behind him in Mandela, but he had good fortune. And the chief piece of good fortune is that as he came to power, the world's economy was about to do that. And Mr. Ramaphosa, on the other hand, has come to power at a point when, for us, the world's economy feels very much like it's over here. And the sense for us is that it has to do a little bit of that. Forget that when he came to power, interest rates in Mbeki was still over 20%, and they'd be cut in half, against the context where household debt levels were 25 percentage points lower than they are today, in a country where household consumption is responsible for 60% of GDP. He had the cheap surplus electricity as a result of Eskom's build programs coming out of the 70s for the growth rates of the 1960s that won't materialize in the 1980s. You have the commodity environment as well, which was a cycle the likes of which the world may never see again. And that, together with the measure of pragmatism in GEAR, saw South Africa achieve successes. The number of people with a job doubled in the first 15 years after 94. So the charge of jobless growth thrown at Mr. Mbeki and his colleagues is wrong. In that early period, 15 years after 94, we built as a country 10 formal houses for every new shack that was erected. And the net number of shacks in the country actually began to decline. And we can quote reams of this stuff for you about service delivery numbers and figures that, despite the weaknesses and failures, are still more than sufficient to justify the claim that we'll fight for, that the living standards floor in the country rose very sharply in the first decade and a bit after 1994. The number of university students multiplied. The murder rate was cut in half to the still very high rates that it's at today, but cut in half is quite something. The number of black buyers of suburban property, admittedly on the lower end of the market, but it's the bonded market, now exceeds the number of white buyers. In some private schools in the early grades, black enrollment is bigger than white enrollment. An economic growth that had been such a catastrophe in the 80s, in 1990, on a per capita basis, inflation adjusted, we were 20% poorer than had been the case in 1980. Economic growth will rise through the immediate post-transition years, and as the Asian crisis released its grip on the world, from around 1999 into December of 2007, we saw the fastest lift in real per capita GDP since the first half of the 1960s. It was relative terms. It was that golden age. Debt levels were cut in half, as I told you, and perhaps most impressive of all, having inherited a budget deficit of near negative 5%, 13 years later, the ANC reported a budget surplus, which is an extraordinary achievement for any country or economy. It's passes as arch fiscal conservatism in Western capitals today. And we did it here just more than a decade ago. And now, according to Stats SA, there are more black than white households in the top monthly expenditure bracket they record, which is something that has happened only in recent years. Of course, on a proportional basis, the world looks different, but there are facets to everything. It's sometimes thrown at us that we peddle pessimism about the country because we are pretty unsugar-coated on the downside. But we were alone, and in the face of extraordinary criticism and using what we later called the Hope series of reports, the next one we publish soon, to do the research to show that by working together in that first decade after 1994, South Africans achieved a vast amount in raising the basic living standards of the great majority of the country's people. And think of this, that had we pretend the global financial crisis didn't happen, and then don't think too hard about whether Mbeki's trajectory was fiscally sustainable on its own. So we just pretend those things aren't issues. Just for a moment of suspended disbelief. Had we continued the trajectory we were on in 2007, for another 20 years we would have become a middle-income society with an unemployment rate of below 10%, and where we are standing today we would have been a decade away from that. And that is what has been lost over the past decade. But Mbeki was an enigma for us, as many of these people are. And that even as he was driving the recovery, he was laying the seeds of its destruction. Because of Zuma and the media around Zuma, it's forgotten that it was Mbeki's cruel health policies that killed hundreds of thousands of people and saw life expectancy in the country fall by 10 years, which is the sort of thing that only genocides and the like are able to do to demographic data and patterns. It was under him, and initially Mandela to an extent, that the arms deal corruption set the precedent for what we would later see with the Gupta family, with VBS, with Bosasa, and with the other horrors that I'm afraid to tell you lie in wait to be uncovered. It was during his presidency, Mr. Mbeki's, that we first ran out of electricity. Unlike one very prominent energy analyst who said recently that Mr. Zuma turned the lights off. He came into the dark. His cabinet, Mbeki's, was instrumental in seeing merit give way to race in the civil service, which set up the failure of so many government departments and agencies, and is a central part of the diagnosis of what has gone wrong at Eskom. And it was Mbeki's unconscionable policy towards Zimbabwe, which set up the collapse of the economy and then the rule of law in that country, and saw us depart as a peer in foreign relations terms of liberal democracies around the world. Mr. Mandela's influence will later fade away, and Mbeki, now increasingly on his own, will go on to make two further and for him politically fatal mistakes that in an odd way will conspire to put us on this deck this evening. The first is that he sent Mr. Zuma to Natal to wrest from Prince Buthelezi the last of the Zulu nationalist vote. The ANC didn't need it, but they wanted it. And they sent him to do what Mandela had even failed in doing, without realizing that if Mr. Zuma succeeds, he will inherit, perhaps from Prince Buthelezi, the mantle of Zulu nationalism that he'll bring back into the ANC and wield as a weapon, exactly as he later did. And unrelated to that, but at exactly the same time, the terrible decisions on HIV and AIDS allowed the long isolated relative left of the ANC to regroup, isolated since Davos. They raised money and built platforms of influence and credibility in attacking Mr. Mbeki on HIV and AIDS. It's a very good thing they did so, because they saved a great many lives. But being good operators at this sort of thing, battle of ideas that we're getting to this evening, it was easy for them in time, once the influence and the money was there, to expand the attacks beyond HIV and AIDS, and before we knew it, the entire GEAR policy framework was under assault. And they were so successful that they managed to turn public and ANC opinion very sharply against Mr. Mbeki. And these two things, the rise of the re-entry of ethnic nationalism into the ANC, and Mr. Mbeki's plummeting popularity, will intersect in December of 2007 at the Polokwane conference of the ANC, where the strangest of bedfellows came together. Mr. Zuma is happy to use the anti-Mbeki wave that has been created by the left, while they are happy to use the ethnic nationalism that he has created in order to take on Mr. Mbeki. The two groups otherwise have absolutely nothing in common. Mr. Zuma to today is still best described by Peter Bruce, who was editor at Business Day, who described Mr. Zuma as a man who never heard an idea he did not like. And that was absolutely the case. He was the least ideological leader the ANC ever had. He had no interest in policy. People who attended meetings of Nedlac and the like said the man was bored out of his mind. He wanted to accumulate assets and other things, and set about doing so, allowing his leftist backers to use the revolutionary term to take back the levers of policy power and influence denied to them since Davos in 1991. And with those levers in hand, they set themselves up to turn back the clock all the way back to the dogma of 1969, the cancelling of 10 bilateral investment treaties, the mad immigration rules, the even madder national health insurance scheme, hiking minimum wages in the face of structural youth unemployment, the draft mining charter, and turning the screws on ever more onerous racial edicts. So the next great ideological turn has come in 2007, and we've gone back through 1991, and we find ourselves almost back where we were outside of Dar es Salaam in terms of the thinking now of South Africa's ruling party. And at the same time, the leader of the country turns out to be interested in looting the state. And we'll take both that, the ideological reversal and the deterioration in governance, and we'll drive it straight through the global financial crisis in 2009. And it's a perfect storm. You couldn't actually put together a worse set of the three things: buoyant global economy, pragmatic policy, and good governance. All of them turn on us in a matter of 18 months. And the consequences are severe and set up the many weaknesses in the socio-economic structure that I took you through in my opening pages this evening. And that had consequences that we saw for ourselves. set up the unthinkable proposition, because it was unthinkable just a decade ago, certainly for many ANC leaders, that the party might go on to lose its national majority, and it might do so as early as the 2020s. That fear triggered an internal power struggle in the party that pitted the victors of Polokwane against each other as both sides sought to escape culpability for the crisis that they had separately but collectively engineered. And the left, in a sense, almost wins that battle by crafting the very brilliant idea of state capture to so discredit Mr. Zuma that Cyril Ramaphosa becomes leader of the ANC. But if you follow these things, you know that Mr. Ramaphosa, while he won, did so by a margin of 179 votes out of 4,700 delegates, meaning that if 90 people had voted differently, Dr. Dlamini Zuma would be in charge today, and she may yet be in the medium-term future ahead of us, something I'm still going to get to. But if you take Mr. Ramaphosa away and pretend he's not there for a moment, and you look up the lineup behind him, highlighted best in the appalling scenes of yesterday evening, what's behind him looks very much like the infrastructure that Mr. Zuma left behind. In January of 2018, in a note to private clients, they were asking us what we thought had happened, and we said the best we can do for you is to repeat the apocryphal tale of Richard Nixon's visit to Beijing in 1970 or 72, in which the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai is said to have said to him, "What do you think the greatest impact was of the French Revolution?" To which Nixon is said to have replied, "It is too soon to tell." And we said it's too soon to tell here. And the story apparently never happened, but those are always the best ones. So Mr. Ramaphosa is there. We're not sure what he is, if he's a reformer. If I said that to you this evening and you asked me to give you the evidence, I wouldn't be able to do so. But behind him, without doubt, are still the ideologues who are still crafting away at the little policies, the NHIs and expropriation without compensation and other things, and state-owned pharmaceutical firms that are, together with state capture, a significant part of the reason for the reversals our country went through over the past decade. The most serious thing they are tinkering away at is the sanctity of property rights. Surrender those now, and we open the door to the erosion of civil rights in a pattern that will follow exactly that played out in countries such as Zimbabwe and Venezuela. We open the door to that, is what I say. We get back to that as well. Who are eroding property rights for exactly that reason. Because they understand that their party has started to come to the end of its road. We've been polling the election results since, I think, September of last year. So we've got a toe in the water in a sense of where it's going, and I think the ANC will do fairly well. There's a dinner that happens in January every year of the Investment Analyst Society in Johannesburg, and it's a great dinner because you have to say, you can't say maybe, this, that. You must say the election result, the stock market on the 31st of December, the growth rate, etc. And there in January I said ANC 57.5% is the ultimate result. And I think they'll end up somewhere in the high 50s. But that's not really the story in this election, because if you drill into the polling data, you see something else. That amongst young people, ANC support is going to be much nearer 50%. Amongst people with matric, probably 46%. And amongst people with a university degree, 23%. By the time you leave suburbs and city centres and townships, the DA has 70% of its votes in the bag, the EFF over 60%, the ANC is not yet at 50%. The ANC voter market is starting to look like that of ZANU-PF 15 years ago. In this election, they will have lost arguably the urban vote, they will have lost the youth vote, and they will have lost the vote of better educated people. Their high 50s will be on the back of older, poorer, more dependent, less educated, rural people who are starting to reach South Africa's average life expectancy, meaning that their numbers will deteriorate at the mortality rate over the next decade, and on the demographics alone, therefore, you can start to make the case that the ANC is on its way out and that it may surrender control of the country as early as 2024. And I think that on current trends, that is now a very real possibility for them. And this is before you consider what we've long established, that ANC support occurs on the back of material improvements in the lives of their supporters. That's why it's so important to identify the progress we did make as a country in the first 15 years after 94. Because if you don't know it was there, or if you dismiss it as a nonsense, then all that you're left with is that ANC voters vote ANC because that's what they do because of some deep loyalty, and they don't really think about it. And of course the loyalty is there, given the history of the country. But what comes first is material circumstances. And if the ANC can't now modernize in order to move out of that ideological cage they've constructed around themselves and get back to a 1991 moment, they cannot introduce the reform to create the resurgent living standards that's necessary to capture the imaginations of the people who will determine the results of the election in 2024 and 2029, and they will be out if they agree to go. There's an idea doing the rounds in the analyst community that 60% is some sort of magic number, and that if Mr. Ramaphosa can get 60%, then reform will follow. And if we talk to wealth managers and banks and the like, and I don't know where that thing's going to be broadcast, but a lot of my clients are wealth managers and banks, so just talk to me before it's published to sort of Merrill Lynch and Goldman Sachs. You sometimes don't get their analysis spot on. If they get 60%, then we can relax and everything will come right. It's plausible, but there are reasons to doubt it. And the first reason is this, that you cannot vote for Mr. Ramaphosa. And that 60% doesn't make him strong. It makes the whole leadership line up in the ANC strong. And picture the scene, something my corporate clients struggle to do. Change your point of view. Put yourself at an ANC National Executive Committee meeting. See Ace Magashule stand up and say, chaps, we got 60%. This guy was telling us if we don't do this and sell out to investors and the like, we can lose. Why do we need him, agent of monopoly capital? We throw him out. And that is one of the potential consequences of a very strong showing for the ANC. The second reason to doubt the 60% thesis is because it ignores the basis of change in political systems and parties. Pressure builds change. And what the 60% theorists want us to believe is that if you reduce and relieve the electoral pressure on the ANC, the greatest pressure a party and a government can face, then it will reform its behavior. It can happen, but it would be a peculiar and a unique case study. But the most important reason for me why the 60% thesis does not work is that it ignores the structural realities of the ANC itself. 70% of cabinet ministers are first and foremost members of the executive committee of the ANC. And it doesn't matter if Mr. Ramaphosa gets 50 or 60 or 70%, the executive committee makeup stays the same. Western firms that talk to us and Western diplomats struggle terribly with this concept, but talk to Russians or the Chinese or Asian diplomats and CEOs. They don't ask too many questions because they understand the nature of the party and the state relationship. And that internal structural bind is such that unless the NEC is willing to reform itself, you cannot reintroduce reforms into the cabinet and therefore policy reforms, let alone ideological modernization, to meet the expectations of these large numbers of young people who are going to be our future voting market. Some people say to us it sounds dire and surely such things cannot happen. And our answer to them we borrow from the very good Zimbabwean author Peter Godwin now in New York, who said last year, reminded us, that no liberation movement that came to power through armed struggle in southern Africa ever surrendered power again. not the MPLA in Angola, SWAPO in Namibia, Frelimo in Mozambique, and most recently ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe. And you dare not doubt that there aren't leaders in the ANC who look at ZANU's victory and they'll see through the horrors and the torture and the fleeing of people, and they don't have a currency anymore, the queues of diesel. And they'll see through all of that, and they'll see that almost 40 years later, they're still in charge. And they will see that as a success, and they'll wonder whether we might not also be successful too. And if they get to that point, and we've then capitulated on the sanctity of property rights, we've given them the opportunity they need to lead us in the same direction. When we talk a bit later, you're welcome to tell us that we are mad, things like Zimbabwe and Venezuela, and that surely this cannot happen. We're thick-skinned, we don't mind it. But if you doubt it, here's something from this year, a statement from the ANC. It's in response to a letter written by 5 of South Africa's most important investment partners, who pointed out in the most reasonable and staid and respectful terms that there are serious policy obstacles to investment in South Africa. The ANC's response is as follows: that the ANC notes with deep concern the interference by Western imperialist forces like the USA, the UK, Germany, Netherlands and Switzerland into the affairs of South Africa, condemns this dramatic holier-than-thou stance of these former colonizers. We would not like to relate to them the history of master-slave relations, do not appreciate the threatening and bullying tone. They have less than honourable intentions. I skipped through it. The ANC wants to be clearly understood. We will not be fooled into swapping one attempt at state capture and corruption for another. This is how we view the interference of these former colonizers, just another form of state capture. We will not be undermined by latter-day colonists. And these are countries whose diplomats and their chief executives try extremely hard to justify committing money to our country in order to create jobs and economic growth and pay tax, and with its back literally against the wall, considering the debt position of the government and the growth rate, running out of money, another way to put it. This is how the ANC responds. And the question that arises for us is this, that if it is willing to respond this way to such powerful and influential actors, how will it one day respond to us, the sort of little people, if it finds that its back is against the wall and it faces losing power? Deny us the chance to stand up for our civil rights and speak our minds and do so freely, and we will be in very serious trouble. We think we can get out of this position, and as a country we've certainly done so before. But for us now, whether we do that this time depends on one thing alone, which is the future trajectory of South Africa's battle of ideas. This is what we do at the IRR. Battle of ideas is what we've practiced for a very long time. The theory holds that the winner in any great ideological struggle is ultimately the side that injects the greatest volume of compelling argument into the public domain. It was pointless to fight the Group Areas Act on its own in the apartheid era if you couldn't dismantle the dominant idea of separate development that sat behind it. But erode the dominant idea and the policies disappeared faster than you could keep up with them. It's put best in the idea that the war in Vietnam was lost in the living rooms of America and on the streets of Washington, and not in the jungles of Southeast Asia. It's the ability to shape and command public opinion that determines public policy. In that shaping now for us, the central theme is the unambiguous rejection of race as the basis of policy in the country. And we are often intentionally misunderstood in what that means. It is good and right, we are clear on that, for a society to help people who are disadvantaged, particularly given our own history. But that must not be done on the basis of race, but on the basis of established socio-economic disadvantage. Given patterns of disadvantage, the beneficiaries will naturally be in the main black, but they will benefit not because they are black, but because they are disadvantaged. And it's a subtle but profoundly important distinction upon which hangs the entire liberal tradition of the country. And now, one of the most heretical things, but you must remember Ellen Hellman in 1979, that you can say about our country today. And we're not naive. We realize that in the short term we're not going to win this fight, although now and again there are some tentative signs. The announcement by the Cricket Council people, the board, that we won't have quotas for the World Cup, which is slightly dishonest. But at least it was said, and it's significant that it was said at all. It reminds slightly, but it's not quite as important as my predecessor, John Cain Berman, who says that apartheid ended in 1968. I think some of the people who've got older here will tell me if the year was right, when John Vorster agreed that the Springboks could play an all-black team that included Maoris. And Jaap Maree, some of you might remember him, of later of the Herstichte Nasionale Partij, apparently said to Vorster, if you do this, one day a black man will marry your daughter and sit next to you in Parliament. And the Nats said, it's nonsense, it's a rugby match. I mean, Maoris, they don't even count. But Maree was right, and that when ideological movements compromise on the core essence of the ideology, as pressure builds, they will compromise more and more and more. And if I took you back in time to a few years after that, Durban in August of 1985, when Pierre Botha appeared in front of his party in what becomes famous as the Rubicon speech and says, I will not lead white South Africa down the path of abdication and suicide, is a quote from that night, in the face of then reality, which looked a lot like today. And a sort of analyst chap like myself stood in before you a few weeks after that and said, for all of that, within a decade, the last leader of the National Party will become the tourism minister in an ANC cabinet. Even Maree couldn't imagine that that might be the black man sitting in Parliament was one thing. A Nat leader being a junior minister in an ANC cabinet, that was a bridge too far. For the time being, this will remain that the subtle distinction for us, race and disadvantage, will remain a controversial, times heretical idea. But our objective is to change that and to ensure that in time the distinction and its acceptance become commonplace. Because only if that happens do you allow for the ideological modernization that whoever governs South Africa at that point will need to go through to sweep away the raft of policies that now stand between us and our potential. To inspire you, change happens only at points of crisis. The still water between major changes, not much happens there. And our next crisis is perhaps not very far away. We continue down the current policy path and drive that through a global pullback, we'll be in real trouble. And the nature of the change that follows the crisis follows the direction of the group that had the greatest influence on public opinion at the point of the crisis. And an enormous lobby, those who were involved in it know, was brought to bear from the late 70s through the 80s to make sure that at the inflection point the vote would be yes and the reforms would happen. And so don't fear the crisis. It presents the only opportunity we have for change. And to inspire you further, that contrary to what you read in social media, Twitter, and read in newspapers that are increasingly terrible, South Africa is not a society that's turned against itself. We do a lot of polling, and we speak now in the office of the 70 or 80 percenters, who are the 7 to 8 out of 10 people who in the calm of their own home tell us, answer questions to reveal that they want exactly the same thing out of the future of the country. To leave in the main rural areas, you're slightly an exception, and to move to cities where they can get nice jobs and put their children in good schools, their families in safe neighborhoods, and accumulate something that they can own. And that further than that, the data shows me, and we were not sort of naive on these things, that 7 or 8 probably like each other and have a vast amount of respect across lines of race and class. Of course, sink through a decade as we've been through and whip up in emotions with racial nationalist incitement, and you can have a problem. But the great unmet challenge of South African politics remains to unite that sort of middle ground of the sort of moderate conservative, using the term conservative in the right sense, sort of good, hard-working, law and order types of South Africans. It's a unity that's threatened every government that's been in charge of this country, and it's a unity that we need to make materialize. And I thank you very much and answer your questions if that's the right time to do so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm happy to.
Okay.
I'm at the right point for questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I just,
Yes.
may I just make a comment, please? Thank you. There was a lot of enlightening stuff that you mentioned, but I think a lot of that stuff, quite honestly, we maybe are all aware of it, to be direct and honest. And I think what maybe we'd like to understand is that we're a community here. What can we actually do to affect the change that is necessary, other than the very minimal influence we have at the ballot box?
I think that the practiced answer is twofold. One of my directors is a man who was seconded to work on the Sullivan Principles for the American business community when they faced pressure to exit the country. And he tells the story of going to see the cabinet minister to tell the minister what the Americans are planning to do. They'll break all the apartheid edicts and laws and no more segregated canteens. He thought it's a good idea to go and tell them one-to-one, really. And he said in the office with this minister was his young aide, who was a sort of 20-year-old PhD from Stellenbosch, sort of up-and-coming Nat type. And he told the minister, we've got to this point and the American business community will do the following. And the minister said to him, I warn you, do not think that you can push this government around. And I think we're getting to a point where if people of any influence in their own communities start to sort of apply the principles that are necessary, if you do uplift people, you do it on the grounds of socio-economic disadvantage and not race, and you start to push the boundaries on what is permissible, you'll meet with ever less resistance. The change is not going to come from within the party itself, but if the seed change is there and it rises from outside in civil society or academia where it's lacking, or business where it's virtually absent, I think the ANC will resist it ever less. So that's part of the answer. Be that change in your own community. Become case studies of its success. The second thing, it sounds terribly narrow and selfish, but we need your support too. I've long abandoned the donor community because they pest and interfere with our independence. Started a program recently called Friends. People join us as friends, they receive some access to our thinking, they make a contribution of whatever amount they choose to. The average is 79 Rand a month, and that kind of contribution is now approaching 40% of our income, the 40% created through the sort of Deloitte-style corporate consulting. And I think there are two hard and real options, but the main one, and we certainly would support that directly, is to, in the realms where you exert influence, as Sullivan tried to do for the American business community, start to become the change that you want to see. Don't blindly go on following the edicts out of Pretoria when you've begun to realize yourself that they are not going to build a better society.
Can I play the devil's advocate here? I mean, what you said is that maybe the tide is changing slowly, and we're in a very dark space at the moment, but there's all this powers that's going to work against. In my mind, the ANC was very, very successful in whipping up this race thing to such an extent now that if you even look at the DA, I mean, they promote very racist sort of policies, as if, so in other words, the ANC got it to such an extent that even the opposition is playing along with him.
We've certainly lost ground in the DA on flirtations with racial nationalism. The party, I think, has lost its ideological tether. People are scared of ideologies. I think they're dangerous things. They're actually very important. You must know why you take decisions. A prominent leader of the relative Afrikaner right, if you can call it that, which isn't exactly what it is, said to me once that he's envious of the Institute. He said, because you know where you stand on every issue. You don't even have to think, because ideology is so deeply established. And I think the DA lost that. And then they started becoming adrift. And then they say, for example, that race is a proxy for disadvantage. And then my colleagues say, okay, we'll now deal with that in business day. And let's see how many days we can keep it going for until they change their mind. So we write a letter on Monday and we say, this is very at odds with what the voters would want. And the DA writes back and says, no, they've been misunderstood. And the second letter of ours is already ready to go. And we say, well, a bookshelf is a bookshelf regardless of whether you pack the books at the top or the bottom, as my colleague Gareth van Onsland contributed to one of the letters. You guys look a lot like the ANC. Oh hell, they think this isn't going well. It's now 3 days in a row in business days before an election. So they write back and they say race is not in fact, the only proxy for disadvantage. And we say, well, that's the only is a very big word. Because previously you said it is not a proxy, and now it's not the only proxy. And if there are other proxies, why didn't you choose any of those? Such as disadvantage itself. And then in that case, why do you need a proxy? And by Friday, they've got some half-assed response. And by Monday, they've decided to go silent again. So I think they can still be won back. Although I think the classical liberals within the DA haven't covered themselves in glory in standing up for principle.
No kidding.
I think some have also had an eye on the bond payments and realised that you're not going to make that salary in the private sector. In the ANC, I think it can be won on the grounds of sheer pragmatism. That as the fiscal crisis deepens and the consequences become apparent, you can frighten them. And you frighten them, as Bill Johnson does in his books, with 3 letters, the IMF. Because that means the surrender of fiscal sovereignty, and that means the surrender of the revolution. There's a dispute in my office about what happened in the 1990s, and some think the turn between 91 and Gear was sincere, and others think it was simply a ruthless calculation. That if the ANC did not turn by the end of the 90s, given what they'd inherited from the Nats, the IMF would have been in play, and they would have, the budget speech would have been written in Washington, and they would have lost policy sovereignty. So the fear of surrendering policy sovereignty can be used to force pragmatism, and must be used to that end. So I think we can win slowly the DA back, but I think we might even have more success with the ANC. And the DA, given its... DA has become, in some respect, and it's a very important party, it's done extremely well in the Western Cape relative to what you see in the rest of the country. Very good evening last night in your neighbouring town with your mayor, who I think seemed to be quite good. But I think under pressure, the ANC might be brought back, but if I am wrong, then we have a serious problem. And you win, and you win, in a sense, it's even. We will lose. There's one aside to that we're developing the idea on, but we don't quite know how it plays out, and that is external modernization of the ANC via management takeover. And how that argument begins to evolve, but we're very early in it, so you can easily shoot it down, is the Chinese will need a champion for Belt and Road, which is their sort of imperialist global strategy, an emerging market champion. Because Western governments are beginning to wake up to the implications of Belt and Road. And in fact, 2 weeks ago, the Assistant Secretary of State in Washington made a speech in which he said that emerging markets must not see China as their friend. It's the first time we'd seen it put as plainly as that. And the Chinese, perhaps anticipating some pushback in time, will need a poster child of the benevolence of Chinese involvement in emerging markets. And because South Africa is so easy to fix, a few pragmatic decisions and a little bit of money, and it's so well integrated in the world that it broadcasts it out to the world far better than many emerging markets. Might the Chinese at our point of crisis beat the IMF to it? Lend us some money. Say, don't worry, you don't have to pay it back. However, we'd like a proxy on the board at Eskom. And they will become our overlords. We will become a colony. And they will modernize the ANC from the outside as a proxy government.
That sounds like the low road, not the high road.
No, but if they want an example of the benevolence, they're not just here to suck us dry, which is the emerging market cliche on the Chinese, then they will essentially do to the ANC on a mini scale what Deng did after Mao, or Lee Kuan Yew, or Park did in Korea.
But my fear is more the sovereignty of the individual there than the economy.
But we will then assume that we will be prosperous and we will be stable.
But controlled.
But controlled. And then there's a thing, and this, I do a lot of these evenings and we get to this point. Yes, but if you're sitting in that terrible dump in Hermanus, the dump has been taken over by shacks. If you can be offered a way off that dump, higher income, but you're a bit controlled, if we had that chap in the meeting this evening, what would he say to us? And had we been successful in the 1990s, well, what we tried in the 90s, had it been absolutely successful, and it's been partly, but we now have a problem, we would have been unique in being poor and becoming free and then becoming rich. The examples were poor and autocratic and increasingly prosperous. And we would have been an outlier to the norm. And perhaps there's a lesson in that. I hope there's not. But perhaps you need that. You need to buy time for governments to make unpopular decisions in order to position their economies to be very competitive.
Right.
So,
You've been mentioning the word the underdog or disadvantaged. Isn't there only about 10% advantaged people in this country at the moment, and we are sitting 90%? All of us sitting over here has got maybe 30 years to live, maximum 20 to 30 years to live. So whatever we are discussing at this stage is not for our lifetime. You're talking about the future. Am I correct in that? And when you said the ANC is getting scared, you're not talking about the ANC as a political party. You're talking about the fat cat sitting up there making the decision. He's scared of his own arse being pulled out from underneath him because he wants to get more, not the guys that's voting for him. The guy voting for him is getting a t-shirt, as they say, and a course bucket. So I don't get
the relative elites, I suppose it depends where you want to draw the line. One of the lines you could draw which would give us a higher proportion, is people with a job. That would give us about the labour market absorption rate, which is what proportion of people of working age work, is about 45%. So we could say perhaps 45% of people. And if you wanted to really push it, you might be able to say that 6, 7 out of 10 households maintain a certain standard of living, and are not appallingly low, as a result of people who are directly plugged into the country's economy, and the rest, depending on welfare, the same. If you want to take it up to people who spend more than 10,000 Rand a month, the figure I know, because I can see in my mind the graphic, whites is 70% and blacks is 10%. So that level of household expenditure, you get back your 10% figure. So it's a relative story. Certainly on the black side of the middle class, there are a lot of young people who have a vast amount on the line. Because as much as their immediate data makes them look like the white middle class, being first generation, they're an entirely different concept, in that the generations that came before them depend on them. Whereas occasionally a white chap who loses his job might fall back onto the older generation for a month or 2 or 3 to cover the bond, for example. So I think there are a lot of young people who have a lot to lose. I think there is, and you do, if you, I was trained by a number of people, but one of the most influential was Professor Lawrence Schlemmer, who I thought was the great social scientist. And Schlemmer said to me, what you guys do is long association, is that you have the block of marble, and inside is David, and the block of marble is all the data and information and noise you hear. You've got to take away the things that are not David until you see. You've got to stand there until you see David and chop away the bits that aren't him, and there he emerges. And I think if we do that with the polling data, there's enough there for me, and there's a bit of intuition in it too, that a lot of that younger black middle class feels that it does have a lot to lose, and is invested in the very much longer term. The fear in the ANC, of course there's the immediate fear of losing your job, because these are not chaps who are going back to their successful careers in business or in law. You can literally go from your brigade of blue lights to a few months later a little hophaisi somewhere. They're not great savings, and if you pinch something, the fear is someone might find that, and that's taken away from you as well. So there is the immediate fear, and I don't think I think it's a very useful thing in lobbying, because the guy's on the line himself. But I think there's also something else for them. There's a sense, I sometimes feel, I've felt once or twice, when we brief them, and we brief them like this, and we have another briefing that's terribly technical with charts and graphics, and for them, awful news. And you do get the feeling, I know my colleagues say it's a bit mad, I feel sometimes a bit sorry for them, that they look so sad, that they've screwed this up. And they might say the boiler has a hole in it. They know why Eskom has failed. And they think that there are people at meetings like this, perhaps who they would suspect, wrongly I think, that there's sort of meetings like this where people sit and say, you know, we always knew they couldn't do it, and now they've failed completely. So I think there's something else, as well as the immediate personal being on the line, that they would want to be successful. And something that troubles me a great deal is when you talk about policy solutions and what might be done, and that we can become a middle-income society, and that you were on that trajectory. I find I struggle to convince them that it can be done. It's almost as if the ANC's mindset has become that the best we can do is prevent the lights from going out most of the time, control the protests, and mitigate the worst effects of poverty. Whereas the end result should be 20, 30 years down the line, we're a middle-income society. And I think a lot of younger people have a lot invested in that, and people are getting very much older. And so I think we do, all of us relatively, actually have a few decades to go, and that these changes will play out in the lifespans comfortably of the great majority of people who are presently alive in the country.
Can I
Yeah.
just ask them?
Yes.
There's one over there.
I saw one, but let me start with Rian and I'll come to you.
This is nameless dread that besets us, that brings us here tonight, in the sense that the problems that should be resolved, there's nothing we can do. I'm following up on your points. I keep on returning to the idea of tax rebellion. That instead of paying taxes to the government, instead of...
Sorry, can you speak a bit louder?
I just like the idea of tax rebellion in a small town like this. Instead of paying money to the government, is we start looking after the poor and disadvantaged in our areas and do so in defiance of the government. I wonder if this is an idea that you can...
Now, Rian's question, if you didn't hear it, is Helen Ziller's tax rebellion, essentially. We didn't say so.
Just to say, this is not going anywhere particular. It's just for me and for my brother that's in Scotland.
No, that's fine.
So you can say whatever you like on that.
Okay. I am always cautious about
Of
where
course.
things go. So you must never do anything that you're not happy to see on the front page of the Sunday Times. Yes.
Can you switch it off in
No, not at all. I'm just saying.
That's not
Very
promise.
little
Don't
we
go
say
anywhere on
that's-
social
There's
media.
very little we say that we don't say on the front page of the Sunday Times. The Rian, I don't know. Firstly, I don't know if you can do it in terms of PAYE and income tax and corporate tax. So practically. Secondly, if you could, I think you already have one. The corporate tax take as a share of GDP has plummeted since 2007. So the effect of a tax rebellion in terms of the scale of the rand's loss to the fiscus is already in play. And all that you can do is you can create even greater pressure. But given the complications in getting PAYE and income tax not paid directly to the fiscus, you probably couldn't replicate the effect. So I'd say to Zilla that we're there in a sense already. The ANC has engineered a tax revolt through policies that are so hostile to growth and the budget deficit is a surplus in 2008. It's a deficit now as bad as at the end of apartheid. The most important indicator is government expenditure as a share of GDP, which is now at a record all-time high point. It's never been higher. Not even the Nats could take it as high as it is at the moment. The point of diminishing returns on tax increases for government are a decade ago already. So I don't see the practicality of it, but that's one thing. The other is, a lot of your tax, a lot gets stolen, obviously, but a lot actually goes into, and did, and still does, despite everything, although it could be better spent, into actually uplifting the basic living standards of large numbers of people. And I said to the people of Hermanus, who'd had such a difficult year, that looking around the town, no fault of theirs, the fact that they don't have protests every day in the middle of Hermanus are perhaps the surprising thing. If you think, as I said earlier, that for some of the residents of Hermanus, when you close the door of your shack, the last thing you see is Marcus Jooster's house. And you know what must that do to the psyche of the place? And do we perhaps tempt losing one of the great assets we have, which is to say that through all of this and the hopeless governance, people contributed, if you're in the top end of the bracket, you contributed between January and the middle of April, every single rand you earned, to the upliftment of someone else. And that might be important in holding this whole thing together as we set off into this very uncertain future. I had the gentleman on my right, and I see that hand. Yes.
I wonder if you could just comment on the possibility of civil war in this country, because a little bit of stuff that I look on social media, there seems to be such radicalization and sides threatening one another, And I saw that BLF was saying that if they don't have their demands satisfied, they're going to go underground and start a struggle there. So could you just comment perhaps on that?
The question is the risk of an armed civil conflict in the country. You know, if you go up to the north, way up there, and you do an evening like this at a game lodge, and we've been drinking brandy since 3 o'clock in the afternoon, then at this stage we're talking about geweer now in the briefing. But I think that's the brandy more than anything else. I don't see who the combatants would be on the two sides. The relatively comfortable middle classes would find their way out quite quickly, or hold up in enclaves such as Hermanus and Stilbaai, which I'm still visiting this week, and Simonstown, where I'll talk soon. Without a significant external organizing force, as we had in the Cold War, all that you have is anarchy of sorts, which in some respects we already have. A decade ago, 9% of protests in the country were violent, and now it's 25%. And that decade has seen a 300% increase in the number of violent protests at the same time. So I think we were already on that anarchic side, and I think in terms of just overall levels of criminal violence, we already have something approaching a civil conflict. But I don't see the combatants. The only possible spin-off, but I'm very unconvinced, I just try and stretch to answer the question, is possibly on at the end of some significant capital and skills and middle class flight out of the country, which is a point that I don't think we're going to reach at all. But should we reach that, which would surprise us greatly, and past that, possibly you have room for some degree of internal ethnic conflict in the country. But I think the odds, we're scenario people, so we find it difficult to say never, because that does bite. But I almost say to you, I don't think so, no.
So are you saying that the groups on either side of this are too small, very few in
well, the one
number?
You don't, as my forefathers did, get on a horse and ride off into the fluctus of the Free State anymore. My lot will fly to Atlanta and carry on there. I think. And so the circumstances have changed greatly. There was a question.
Are we going to see any prosecutions and arrests in the ANC for all their mischievousness?
Now the questions on prosecutions and arrests. Well, we've seen very little to date.
Yeah.
To be generous to Mr. Ramaphosa, if you can buy the long game, he's slowly strangling his adversaries, and soon they'll be checkmated and they'll be prosecuted. And at the end of the Commission, the Zondo's work, which should end towards the end of next year, the new director of prosecutions and her team will be ready, and you'll see the prosecutions happen one by one. Structurally, inside the ANC, it's hard to see that happen, because the extent of the rot is so great that very few people could sleep easily knowing it's started. So when they start somewhere, if they start with a small fish or a big one, it will be easy to rally the troops together and say, listen guys, I'm not going quietly.
No.
We better put a stop to this. So again, the internal structural obstacle to ANC modernization, I think, is very important. And it's just if you play the chess game and you try and do it, it's hard to see how it works without a swift strike one night where the top 10 gets locked up. And Mr. Ramaphosa talks to those who remain, and says to them, this has happened, screw with me now and you will be number 11 and 12 and 13. And if this net catches you now, I cannot help you and you're on your own. Without that kind of brinkmanship almost on his part, it's hard to convince me that he's going to win this fight. Because it's also the first fight that he's had. This mythology built up around him deserves some critical interrogation. He was the great unionist who brought the mining firms to their knees. But it doesn't work, that argument, because Anglo-American was only too delighted to have him. Because they'd been pushing for reform, as our archives reveal, desperately for decades. And he was the best thing that could happen. And between him and the Anglo executives, they achieved a lot of success. The Anglo was not an opponent of Mr. Ramaphosa's at the time. Then we had the negotiations where you had the great negotiator, but that also doesn't really hold up, because he was advised by the brilliant and ruthless Mandela about what to say, and his opponents, with respect, you never know who's in the audience, were not collectively the most intimidating group of intellects the country had ever assembled. And they themselves wanted to change. I mean, they'd had a referendum beforehand to say, we want to give up. And then you get Ramaphosa, the great business leader, but he's not an industrialist titan. He was given a lot of wealth and he managed it very well by following the good advice of people around him. And now for the first time, if you go along with that, and lots of people will argue the case, but for the first time now he faces an opponent. Ace Magashule is a dangerous character. David Mabuza is even more so, because he's not as stupid as Ace is to get a book written about himself and then to send a bunch of thugs to Hyde Park or wherever it was to try and assault them, which is just... Mabuza is worse than Ace, but you don't know, because Mabuza is clever. And you've got a character like Julius Malema, who I think is very clever, and who is certainly aiming at deputy president of the ANC. He wants them to lose power. It's been the play from the beginning. And then when that election comes, when they think they're going to lose, to sit by the phone and wait for the Secretary General to phone and say, okay, and Madlema will say deputy president of the ANC. Or he says, go off on your own. And I think given those various outcomes, my point is simply that yes, the long game can succeed, but too many people and analysts write only the long game pieces, as if it will succeed. You must have some capacity for doubt.
And the Libyan millions, are they just a rumour?
Oh, it's a brilliant cartoon on that. I don't know if you saw it. The cartoonist writes, there's Zuma waking up and the ghost of Gaddafi standing at his bed. And the ghost says to him, Switzerland, you idiot, not Swaziland. To my left.
What do you think the rise of Ecosa will have on the DA and ANC votes in the coming elections?
The rise of?
Ecosa.
Well,
ICOSA.
It's a Karoo kind of based party. It's a
Is it
co-nationalist,
Ecosa and
oh yes, they were there last night actually. They came to introduce themselves. I've heard a bit about them. I don't know. If there is a great impact they will have here, it's something I've definitely missed. So I can't answer. But generally the smaller parties are having some effect on the ANC in the Western Cape, where it should retain its majority. But given its performance and that of the ANC, the statement should be it will retain its majority. And the should comes in because the polling shows that so many of the little guys are nibbling little bits off the DA, both nationally and in the Western Cape itself. To the Freedom Front predominantly, but not big chunks, just enough chunks to slow DA growth further. Can one of the small guys one day take off? I don't think any of the existing, the Copes. Cope came with the Trojan horse from the ANC that destroyed it from the inside. I think the ACDP message that's on the social side doesn't resonate enough with public opinion in the country. The Freedom Front will do a little bit, but lacks any imagination of looking to the future. And the one interesting one is the Purple Cow party, which is this thing started by a group of young entrepreneurs. Prominent in it is the host of the Renegade Report, Roman Kavanagh. Kanthan Pillay is its leader. And they started late. They self-financed their party. They came for tea, and we said you'll do well to get 1,000 votes, knowing what it takes. But they've got a bit of media traction subsequently, and on the way here I had a call from a journalist about manifestos of parties, and I said they're mostly useless. And she said, is there any party with a good manifesto? And I said, actually you've got to go and read these Purple Cow guys. Their manifesto could turn the country around. And this was the person of the Financial Mail. I'm very interested to see whether they deign to mention as silly an idea as the Purple Cow Party, or the South African Capitalist Party, the ZACP. But I think the best small parties are going to do now is nibble little bits off the fringes in the immediate election ahead of them.
The Green Party?
But these things, they're not coming up on our radar.
It's the only one that I've heard.
They're not. They don't pop up on the polling radars at all for us, which is why your one. I was trying to think as I answered whether we've even seen it come up on the Western Cape polling, and we just get a little blip for Patricia de Lille, a tiny little one, and the rest aren't visible. Yeah.
What percentage of people in this country do vote, and how many don't vote?
I forget the percentage, but registration levels amongst young people are very low, and not because of apathy, but because, as some of my colleagues say, that they're very good political analysts, and that's why they don't vote. Because if you took stay with this on the shack settlement on the dump in Hermanus, and you put the three political leaders in front of that community, none of the three could convince those people that you will be off that dump and out of that shack 5 years after you vote for us. So the low level of voter turnout is not as some European Nordic funded philanthropists think that we must teach Africans to vote. It's actually because young voters have a very astute read and don't buy in, and that's why they go to the protest movement.
Yeah.
Because the protest movement works. And because it works, it's because we've been talking about it tonight here in Barrydale. Because they spent 3 weeks blockading a road in Hermanus. It shows. So younger people don't vote. But the figure I do know, I can't tell you the turnout percentage, but I know that our pollsters are working on a turnout of around 70% of registered voters. But that's an undercount because young people don't register to begin with.
Yeah.
But I do know this, which is an interesting one, that there will be more people who are eligible to vote who do not vote than the number of people who will vote for the ANC.
Wow.
So the biggest constituency party in the country doesn't vote, and if you've ever sold anything, you'll know there's a big market, it doesn't like anyone's product, and it's a comment on the quality of our political leadership that no one in the spectrum has been able to capture what is a free market big enough for you to run the country with, if you were to do it effectively. Yes, sir.
341,000 registered voters under the age of 20.
I know the number is very low. I don't know what it is, but I know it's proportionate. It's amazingly low, in fact, the under 20s. From somewhere around, sort of 10% of the scale, so that would sound about right.
And the chances of xenophobia?
Must be. Has to be.
How?
Has to continue. And it's a predictable pattern now. You inspire the xenophobia to deflect attention and expel frustration, and then you condemn it. In the same way that Ace Magashula condemns this invasion of his launch. It's the most cynical characteristic of really authoritarian leaders, that they will create the circumstances and then pull back and condemn the results, and do so time and again. So I think the xenophobia unfortunately continues. I see 1, 2, and then the lady.
Francie, you remember when Zuma went, there were rumors that he had approached the army for a sort of a coup thing, and they turned him down. We never read anything about the army, about its leanings and its agendas, or what its political stance might be, the leadership of the army. What is going on there?
We don't know much. We don't think much is going on there. we think that is.
Well, you see, these are people with guns, okay?
Yeah.
And it's important what goes on there.
Yeah.
The ones that haven't been stolen.
We don't know if it has the enthusiasm to mount any sort of action in a coherent manner. But it's a dead zone in the analysis. It's a dead zone, black zone in the analysis.
I'm concerned about
because it's not properly understood, and I would think that you're very wise to be concerned about it, and that we shouldn't go for sort of the flippant answer that the rifle will break down before it gets to Pretoria, so there's no risk of a coup.
Yeah, I mean, guns are guns,
But I think we're not sure what's going on there. We know what's going on opaquely, of course, in state security, which is deeply factionalized and compromised, and prosecuting political battles, but often doing so in an inept manner. Ineptitude, though, is one of the things that does save us at times from a bad policy.
Yeah, but it's not a good plan.
No, it's not a good plan, but it does. that business lament that we have excellent policy, we must just implement is wrong. We can.
But is it true that Zuma wanted to introduce a state of emergency?
I don't know. You see, the sort of thing that can happen there is maybe it is discussed, and then immediately it's jettisoned, and maybe there it slips out, and then there was a discussion about it. But he did do a very odd thing that afternoon when he called the SABC to his house or his office.
I remember the Fiat.
And he gave that long rambling interview, and we sat in the office together. And we've got this little lounge, and we all sat there, and we were waiting. State of emergency, or what, and then he just said goodbye, and there was nothing.
No,
that would suggest that at the end he wasn't well advised. There wasn't much strategy behind it, because that thing was just a funny thing.
But he's out there now without constraints, whatever they were on him when he was president. He's now loose.
And his infrastructure is still out.
Yeah.
And that's the more important thing. Too much focus was on the man himself. But his infrastructure is what was important. And I think that infrastructure is still there, still very in command.
He's a master of it.
And the infrastructure realized that he had become the albatross. And because of the obsession with Zuma the man, much of the infrastructure got away lightly. When the focus should have been the institution, and behind the institution the ideology. And if you identify that, you see where the problem really lies, and you address it. And to today, in private, we'll get concessions on it. But there are very few people in public who will stand up and push the ideological source of the problem as hard as we have done here this evening.
Any possibility of a split in the ANC?
The question is on a split in the ANC. I don't think so, because I think the splits have already happened. The cope going off was the split of the Mbekiites and the better chaps, but as I said, the Trojan horse went with. and destroyed it from within. The Malemas took a big piece away, which they'll try to come back, prodigal son stuff, at some point in the future. And what's left, therefore, what is departed from the ANC are the only bits that can survive outside of the protection of the ANC. Because they have the marketing genius or the professional qualification. Manuel's gone to work for Rothschild, for example. What's left in the ANC needs the parasitic access to the state in order to survive financially. So they can't break away because they don't have the political marketing brilliance of a Malema, and they don't have careers. So now they're all in this together. The great struggles are over. The great ideological thing, what holds parties together? Great struggles, ambitions, enemies, ideologies. For the ANC now, it is that if we all sit quietly and don't rat on each other, we can feed another day. But let's hold this together now, chaps. Don't anyone...
It sounds like criminals.
Yeah, but it is. It is. There are, I mean, a significant proportion of the lists are criminals. And the spokesperson says we've applied the highest ethical standards, because if you've been sentenced to more than a year in jail without the option of a fine, you cannot represent the ANC. I mean, this is, it has, and it's not an exaggeration, deteriorated to, at a national level, a criminal syndicate in many important respects, which is replicated, you seem to be spared it, in small towns around the country, little microcosms of what Johnson calls rural barons, who run their little fiefdom the same way that the NEC runs the country.
Something to consider, the balance of power in the ANC is 50-50 between Zuma and Ramaphosa. One half has something to gain, the other half has something to lose. The current election will be the last that will go through before those who got free education discover that a university degree does not equal a job. The social grants have bought votes. That's getting stale. The free education was the next ticket to buy votes. But come the end of the year, going into next year, where all those university graduates walk around with a degree in their sweaty hand and they still can't find a job, that's where the cut comes. Now, who is more desperate? Him who has something to gain, or him who has something to lose?
Yeah, you're completely correct, I think. The antidote, of course, becomes that moderate middle, which has always been there, and is probably the reason that we've avoided getting into serious trouble at important junctions in the past. And pressure does build reform. And while it's very hard to do an end run around your analysis, societies that get themselves deep into trouble, if at the point of crisis the reformist voice was increasingly dominant, the post-crisis framework does often reflect that reformist voice, and that remains one of our long-term options. And I think I just want to thank you before I hand back and say thank you very much for coming out this evening. The Blue Cow has been extremely generous in looking after me, and thank you very much for that. And Rian, yes, thank you very much. Rian very useful in setting this up, and a follow-up round. And a follow-up round in the north. And thank you very much for hosting and introducing and arranging. We appreciate it immensely. If you choose to ever hear from us again, there is a clipboard thingy there. You can put your telephone number on it, and one of my people will give you a ring in the course of the week and try and entice you to become a friend of the organisation. And there's a little brochure thingy too that tells you about what we do. And we as I try and escape that terrible thing that I sounded like Deloitte's, if you ever want us back, I've got colleagues who say very interesting things. You only need to ask, and we're often in Cape Town. It's easy to come up here. I'd be very happy to come and talk to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much.